What's up guys, I'm BTC. Both Zarya and Symmetra just got a pretty substantial hidden buff, and more changes have also been made to Symmetra's teleporter as well. Very quickly, I want to mention two small changes on the PTR that involve D.Va and Hammond. First up, D.Va's pilot ultimate cost was reduced by 12%. The reason for this is because they just did an across-the-board nerf to all of the ultimate costs, and this was making it so that it was harder for D.Va to get back into the mech than it was supposed to. So they just reduced the amount of that ultimate to compensate. The other mech ultimate has not been changed. The change for Hammond also involved his ultimate, and that was the projectile speed was reduced from 13 down to 12, and this might seem like it's a nerf, but it's not really. A lot of Hammond players were complaining that the new increased projectile speed was spreading out the individual mines too far, so they pulled it back just a little in order to allow better control of the ultimate. It went from 10 to 13, and now it's down to 12. And now moving on to Symmetra and Zarya. Just recently, the developers for Overwatch have been participating in a lot of live streams, answering questions about the new hero, role queue, and other balance changes. One of the really big ones that kind of went under the radar for a while was a change to Zarya and Symmetra. For a long time, there's been a persistent bug causing them to do less damage than they should have been. This doesn't mean that their damage per second has been increased. What it involves is when applying damage to your target based on how well you are tracking that character. While it may not seem like much, the developers emphasize that this is a substantial improvement to the characters and their damage output. Essentially, what happens is the damage will fall off if your tracking on the target isn't perfect, but it was falling off much sooner than it was supposed to. This means that the really high skill players with extremely good tracking ability probably aren't going to notice much of a change on this, but for those players who have a harder time following their target, then this is going to increase their damage. So it's not like it's an increase to the raw damage output, but rather based on how good or bad your tracking ability is. Last week, when they updated the PTR with role queue and that huge balance patch, I mentioned how they made changes to Symmetra's teleporter that were exactly like something that I had proposed in a previous video, but that actually isn't quite the case. I was trying a little too quickly to finish that video, and I didn't pay quite as much attention to all of the Symmetra changes as I should have. I should have paid more attention to that, so that's my bad. In fact, what they did to the character and the teleporter is not what I suggested, only partially. Here are all the changes that they made previously. You can see them on the screen, and as you can see, they made the teleporter last infinite duration. They also gave the player the ability to destroy the teleporter themselves, and these are two things that I did in fact suggest, but they went beyond that and added a bunch of other things that I didn't mention that are turning out to not be quite that good. They made it so that the teleporter went a good deal further than it had previously, and also increased the cooldown on the ability. Furthermore, they didn't include one of the most important mechanics that I said would be required, which is making the teleporter cooldown function the same as Torbjorn's turret does. And what that means is if the enemy destroys the turret, it goes on a full duration cooldown, but if Torbjorn destroys it himself, it goes on a much shorter cooldown. Just today, they made some more changes, so let's check that out. They went back and changed the cooldown from the 15 seconds back down to the 12 seconds where it was before. And they also changed the reuse time from the 1.5 back down to the 1 second. So they essentially reverted both the cooldown and the reuse time on the teleporter. I think both of these changes that they made today are good, but there are still two fairly big problems with it. The first is that you don't get that reduced cooldown when you destroy your own teleporter, and I think that needs to be included. It would allow Symmetra a lot more flexibility in moving the teleporter around instead of simply leaving it in one place because it has such a large cooldown even when you break it yourself. The second problem is the range on the teleporter. It's much too far. The reason why this is such a big issue is because the new version of the teleporter is effectively a slightly worse version of the old ultimate teleporter that Symmetra used to have. Simply put, the way the teleporter works now, it's a very common strategy to leave the teleporter right outside your own spawn room in order to allow your team to get back into the fight or back to that capture point much faster. Again, because the range is so large. If they had left it at the previous range of 25 meters, it's still possible that this strategy might still be in use, but I would think to a lesser degree. As a result, I think there are still some changes that need to be made to the teleporter in order to improve its flexibility and also minimize that spawn room strategy. So here's what I would do. For the cooldown, I would make it so that if the enemy destroys it, then the ability gets put on a full 12-second cooldown. But if Symmetra destroys it herself, it's much shorter. I'd say around 5 seconds sounds good. So like Torbjorn's turret, it would give a little bit of a punishment if the enemy destroys it, but it still provides flexibility if you need to move it around. Next, the duration would continue to be infinite until destroyed. The range would be reduced down to 20 meters. This would still make it viable in the vast majority of situations where Symmetra is using it to either move her team around the map or to drop a bunch of sentries behind the enemy players, because that is a very common tactic. While at the same time, this would de-incentivize the strategy of using it right outside the spawn room. Again, I'm sure probably some people would still try to use it like that, but it wouldn't be nearly as good, and they would lose a tremendous amount of functionality and effectiveness if they just leave it outside the spawn room instead of using it in other ways. Lastly, I would slightly reduce the deployment time from 2 seconds down to perhaps 1.5 seconds. You certainly don't want the teleporter to appear instantly out of nowhere, but as it is right now, it's probably a little bit on the slow side. I think these changes would greatly increase the flexibility and effectiveness of the teleporter, while again minimizing that spawn room strategy. I also think that the character could probably benefit from having a damaging ultimate as opposed to being the only DPS character with a purely defensive ult, but that's a topic for another time. In the meantime, Symmetra will be doing a little bit better damage because of that bug fix and hidden change, and hopefully the other issues will be addressed soon as well. But let me ask you guys, if you could give Symmetra a damaging ultimate, what would it be and how would it work? Let me know down below. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more, subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss anything. Also, come hang out in my Discord server and my Twitch live stream. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to see what kind of cool VIP rewards you can get, check the links down below. And remember, always blame the controller, because it's never your fault.